کنفرانس آنلاین در پارلمان اروپا. استمرار جنایت علیه بشریت در ایران. وظایف سیاسی و اخلاقی اروپا.
سخنرانیهای 37 پارلمانتر و شخصیت سیاسی اروپا. فراخوان به پیگرد عاملان و آمران قتل عام 67 و کشتار 1500 تن در قیام آبان 98 و تأکید بر اعزام هیأت تحقیق بین المللی به ایران.
سخنرانیهای استرون استیونسون، پاولو کازاکا، کیموساسی.
$60 million Iranians are now living below the international poverty line. The grinding privation and penury has driven people to sell their livers, their kidneys, and even the corneas for cash. Sick organ traders are exploiting the poor to rake in huge profits. The Iranian currency, the rial, is in free fall. It's lost 49% of its value so far this year as the US ramps up economic pressure with renewed sanctions. Iran, as one of the world's leading oil and gas producers, now has one of the world's most worthless currencies, with hyperinflation topping 34.4% annually. But 41 years of venal corruption, dim-witted incompetence, and brutal oppression by the fascist Iranian government has brought this once prosperous and successful nation to its knees. Revolution is in the air. When the theocratic regime announced a massive threefold hike in gasoline prices in November 2019, millions of poor Iranians took to the streets in protest. And of course, the mullahs' predictable reaction was to order their Gestapo, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, the IRGC, and their internal security thugs, the Basij, to brutally suppress the nationwide uprising. Black-clad and masked IRGC snipers gunned down unarmed protesters from the rooftops of government buildings, shooting to kill. Basij goons beat young demonstrators with batons. 1,500 protesters were killed. Thousands more were wounded. The IRGC dragged injured protesters from their hospital beds. They were taken to specially prepared torture centers where many perished. Over 12,000 were arrested and thrown into the regime's medieval prisons. Dozens have been sentenced to death for daring to challenge the authority of the fascist dictatorship. As the so-called moderate President Hassan Rouhani, in his absurd speech to the UN General Assembly, proclaimed that, in his words, political freedom at home is very important to us. He said, as the most ancient democracy in the Middle East, we are proud of our democracy and we will not compromise our freedoms with foreign intervention. You know, his pathological lies have fooled no one inside Iran. The seething resentment and antipathy to the clerical regime has begun to boil over. Poverty-stricken Iranians are appalled that their government continues to pour money and military personnel into Syria in support of Bashar al-Assad's bloody civil war. They are horrified that the mullahs are funneling endless Iranian cash to the Houthi rebels in Yemen, to Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the vicious Shia militias in Iraq, they're shocked to learn that vast resources are being channeled into the secret production of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, despite Rouhani's international denials. And they're dismayed that corruption and incompetence has seen the death toll from COVID-19 soar to over 116,000 nationwide. Resistance units of the main democratic opposition movement, the People's Mujahideen Organization, the PMOI, MEK, have been formed in every town and city in the country. Sporadic outbursts of anger and protests against the regime have occurred daily, with defiant youths torching and vandalizing regime-affiliated sites. As we've heard repeatedly, the execution of the young wrestling champion Navid Afkari, despite a global campaign to stop his judicial murder, has sparked renewed fury across the nation. His hanging outraged young Iranians who regarded Afkari as a sporting hero. Young resistance fighters have attacked courthouses, government buildings, and IRGC and besieged bases in towns and cities throughout Iran. A center for promoting fundamentalist Islam was torched in the city of Karaj. Banners, posters, and images of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and of the terrorist IRGC Quds Force General Qasem Soleimani, the man who was killed by a drone strike in January. These banners and posters have been repeatedly targeted and set on fire by protesters. Marchers and street protests routinely chant slogans such as "The Supreme Leader's end is near" and "Rise up to avenge Navid's execution." Anti-regime slogans and messages from the Iranian resistance leader Masoud Rajavi and President-elect of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, Mariam Rajavi, regularly appear on walls and hoardings. As resistance to the mullahs continues to grow across Iran, there are increasing demands for the international community to end their policy of appeasement and show their support for the Iranian people. The ongoing torture and execution of political prisoners is a crime against humanity and continues because the United Nations has singularly failed to hold the mullahs regime to account for the massacre of over 30,000 political prisoners, mostly supporters of the PMOI-MEK in 1988. Although there is irrefutable evidence of this horrendous crime, which even senior figures in the regime openly admit and boast about, no one has yet been indicted for this horror, one of the worst cases of genocide of the late 20th century. The revolution is coming, and when it comes, the mullahs will face justice, and those in the international community who have sought to appease them will be held answerable and shamed in the court of public opinion. Thank you very much.
Dear Madam President Rajavi, delighted to listen to your assessment of the situation on Iran. And as we are about to end our conference, I would like to elaborate a bit on one point that I think it's fundamental, the one of that was raised actually by at least 3 honorable members of the European Parliament, Benoit Bitreau, Javier Sarsalejos, and Petras Ostrovicius, which is the nature of the crime committed by the Iranian regime that was in evidence with the so-called execution of Navid Afkari. But as it was said before, what we have seen here with Mr. Afkari was not a death penalty, was a state crime, was an execution that did not even follow the procedures set by the Iranian regime. And actually, this is not the first time. This is not the second. This has been a system that was clearly symbolized by the fatwa of 1988 that ordered the religious supreme leader of the time, the late Ayatollah Khomeini. He ordered the murder of all the political prisoners, the vast majority of them members of the People's Mujahideen of Iran, some that were not, that were on other organizations, but were political opponents, and he ordered their murder. This is, according to the Swiss law, clear a genocide. And I am absolutely delighted to see that although so many years afterwards, the Swiss authorities understood that the murder of Kazem Rajavi is included in this genocide. It was not in 1988, it was 2 years after, but it comes out of the same fatwa. It comes out of the same regime. And the question is, dear members of the European Parliament, that whereas the genocidal leaders of Rwanda that made this horrendous massacre are not in power, they have been some of them brought to trial. The same happened in Cambodia, or even those responsible for the genocide in 1970 in Bangladesh. This has not been the case in Iran. And no one that is truly friend of human rights can rest in peace, can be in peace with himself up to the moment that this genocide is brought to justice. This is a must that we, when we were in the European Parliament, we tried our best to accomplish, but seeing so many European parliamentarians, I am so glad to see that this struggle is going on, and it can never stop. This criminal regime, their responsible people have to be brought to trial for genocide. Thank you.
Thank you so very much indeed. And Madam Rajavi, dear friends of human rights, I must say Iran is a great country. She has very proud history and excellent culture. And in fact, the country should be very rich because she has a lot of oil, but that's not the truth of today. Today, Iranian people are the hostess of the worst dictatorship in the world of today. Because of the corruption, many people live in hunger, and the country is isolated because it exports terrorism. I think the history shows there's a clear path to prosperity. Europe learned after the World War II that we have to trust in certain values which are democracy, human rights, rule of law, market economy, and also the equality between men and women. And if you go on this path, you'll be successful. I understand Iranian people protest today because of the terrible conditions in the country. And that is why the dictatorship in Iran is very afraid. They know what happened in Eastern Europe, late 1980s, when people took the power in their own hands. The Iranian dictatorship is desperate at the moment, and that is why they try to crush their own people. And it's a very bad thing that this means that protesters have been killed, murdered, and many of them sit in the prison at the moment. Navid Afkari's name has been mentioned today several times. And as said, he was hanged a few days ago. And the fact is that Iranian authorities tortured Navid for weeks. In a smuggled letter, he described how for 50 days he was beaten with sticks and batons on his arms, buttocks, and back. And he had a plastic bag over his head until he was almost suffocated. And finally, he was executed. He was murdered. This single case, I think, is a hero of people, and we must remember his memory. I think the international community must do something at this very moment. European Union especially must take action against Iranian dictatorship. What must be done? It is, first of all, we need economic sanctions against Iran. But then when you put economic sanctions, of course, you have to try to take care that there's no black trade that's fueled by the dictatorship and the corruption. Then we need also personal sanctions. There must be sanctions against those people who are leading the country and who have been involved in the murdering of the people. It means their money abroad must be freezed, and if they ever come outside the borders of Iran, so they must be seized and they must be brought into the court of law and they must be sentenced for their crimes. Unfortunately, many Iranian diplomats as well have been engaged with terrorism. And it means the European Union member countries must look how many diplomats Iran can have in their own countries. There must be thorough surveillance. And I think Iran must not have that many diplomats in our countries because of the terrorism. And one thing what the European diplomats must do in Iran is that they must go to the prisons, look after the demonstrators, try to protect them, help them, and make their cases very well known to try to save their lives. And finally, what's very important as well is that there's an investigation to all mass murders. Very important is the murdering of many people in 1988. Those who are guilty must be brought in front of the court. And finally, I must say, there is only one way that can really solve the situation, and that is that the Iranian people take their own fate in their own hands. We need a change of the government, change of the regime in Iran. That is the only durable solution. Thank you. The fight continues.